the most famous grave in Hollywood, was almost destroyed. Not by time, not by weather, but by obsession. Somebody vandalized Marilyn Monroe's crypt, scratching and writing across the marble of the woman the world still refuses to let go. And when photos of the damage appeared online, people were horrified. Because more than 60 years after her death, fans still travel across continents just to stand beside her grave for a few seconds. To leave flowers. To press lipstick kisses against the marble. To whisper goodbye to a woman they never met. But the deeper story surrounding Marilyn Monroe's final resting place is stranger, sadder, and far more disturbing than most people realize. $1 million burial plots. A man buried upside down beside her. Hugh Hefner resting inches away from a woman he profited from, yet never even met. And a cemetery filled with the ghosts of Hollywood dreams that ended in tragedy. Today, we're stepping inside one of the most haunting places in Los Angeles. And what we found there says everything about fame, loneliness, and the terrifying price of becoming immortal. In the middle of one of the busiest cities in America, hidden between traffic, glass buildings, and luxury apartments, sits a cemetery so quiet most people drive past it without noticing. Pierce Brothers Westwood Village Memorial Park. At first glance, it doesn't look legendary. It looks small, almost ordinary. But beneath the grass and marble walls lie some of the biggest names in entertainment history. Actors, musicians, comedians, icons. People whose faces once covered magazines, movie screens, television sets, and billboards across the world. Dean Martin, Farrah Fawcett, Roy Orbison, Frank Zappa, Truman Capote, Burt Lancaster. And tucked inside a crypt wall near the back of the cemetery is Marilyn Monroe. Even now, more than 6 decades after her death, her grave remains one of the most visited celebrity burial sites on Earth. Every single day, people arrive carrying flowers, letters, photographs, lipstick tubes, and grief. Some stay for seconds. Others stand silently for minutes, unable to leave. And perhaps the strangest part of all, many of them were not even alive when Marilyn Monroe died. Yet somehow, they still miss her. Then one morning, photos appeared online. Images showing Marilyn Monroe's crypt covered in strange markings and scratches. At first, people assumed it was fake. Surely nobody would vandalize the grave of one of the most beloved women in history. But the images spread quickly. And panic followed, because Marilyn's grave had already become something sacred to fans. The lipstick marks visitors leave behind were one thing that had become tradition, a strange ritual of affection. But this was different. Someone appeared to have written directly onto the marble itself, defacing it, claiming ownership over someone who had already spent her entire life being consumed by the world. And suddenly, people weren't just angry, they were emotional, protective. Because deep down, many fans feel like Marilyn Monroe belongs to them emotionally. Not as a celebrity, but as a symbol of heartbreak, of vulnerability, of loneliness hidden behind beauty. When visitors returned to the cemetery afterward, the damage appeared to have been cleaned away. The marble polished, the scratches removed. But standing there, you could still feel the tension. This strange mixture of admiration, obsession, and possession. As if even death itself couldn't separate Marilyn Monroe from the world's need to hold onto her. That obsession didn't begin at her grave. It followed Marilyn Monroe her entire life. Because before she became Marilyn Monroe, she was Norma Jeane Mortenson. A lonely little girl passed between foster homes and instability. A child who grew up feeling unwanted, unseen, disposable. Long before Hollywood transformed her into the ultimate symbol of glamour. She was simply trying to survive. And maybe that's what people still connect to today. Not just the beauty, not the fame, but the sadness underneath it. Because Marilyn Monroe represented something painfully human. The feeling of being adored by everyone, while truly known by no one. Hollywood loved her face. Studios loved her image. The media loved her scandals. But very few people seemed interested in protecting the actual woman behind the persona. And over time, that loneliness became unbearable. By the early 1960s, Marilyn Monroe had become one of the most famous women alive. But privately, she was exhausted, emotionally fragile, struggling with insomnia, anxiety, failed relationships, and the crushing pressure of living as a fantasy the world demanded she maintain forever. And then, in August 1962, everything ended. When Marilyn Monroe died at only 36 years old, the world went into shock. Newspapers exploded. Fans cried openly in the streets. Radio stations interrupted programming. Because Marilyn Monroe wasn't just a celebrity. She was a phenomenon. Beautiful, desired, mysterious, tragic, and suddenly, gone. But her funeral was not the massive public spectacle many expected. It was small, private, quiet, held right here at Westwood Memorial Park. Joe DiMaggio, the baseball legend who once married Marilyn, personally arranged much of the funeral. Despite their complicated history, he reportedly remained deeply protective of her long after their marriage ended. And outside the cemetery walls, crowds gathered hoping to catch one final glimpse. But they never truly got closure. Maybe that's why people still come here today. Because Marilyn Monroe never really left emotionally. Not for Hollywood. Not for America. Not for the millions who saw pieces of themselves inside her sadness. Then the story becomes even stranger. Because over time, being buried near Marilyn Monroe became one of the most expensive burial opportunities in Hollywood. At one point, a nearby crypt reportedly went up for sale for nearly $2 million. $2 million to spend eternity beside Marilyn Monroe. And people were genuinely interested. Because these crypts are no longer just burial spaces. They're status symbols. Pieces of Hollywood mythology. The illusion of closeness to immortality itself. One nearby crypt eventually sold for nearly $200,000. And suddenly, death inside the cemetery started feeling less like grief, and more like real estate. Just beneath Marilyn Monroe's crypt lies Hugh Hefner, founder of Playboy magazine. The irony is almost unbelievable. Marilyn Monroe helped launch the Playboy empire.
Her photos made Hefner rich. Her image helped define an era. Yet the two never actually met in person. Not once. And still, Hefner purchased the crypt beside her decades before his death, wanting, in some symbolic way, to remain beside the woman who represented Hollywood fantasy itself. Some people call it romantic. Others find it unsettling, because even in death, Marilyn Monroe remained tied to an industry that profited endlessly from her image. A woman the world never stopped consuming. But perhaps the strangest story inside the cemetery belongs to a man buried upside down. Literally. A nearby crypt contains Richard Poncher, whose dying wish was reportedly to be buried face down above Marilyn Monroe. Why? According to the story, he once joked to his wife, "If you don't bury me upside down, I'll haunt you forever." And unbelievably, she honored the request. It sounds absurd, almost comedic. But somehow, inside Hollywood, it makes strange sense. Because in this city, even death becomes performance. Even burial becomes mythology. And standing among these crypts, you begin realizing something disturbing. Hollywood doesn't just preserve celebrities. It preserves obsession. Walk through this cemetery long enough, and you realize Marilyn Monroe is far from the only tragic story buried here. Nearby rests Dorothy Stratton. Young, beautiful, a rising star, she became Playboy Playmate of the Year and seemed destined for enormous fame. Then at only 20 years old, she was murdered by her estranged husband. Hollywood promised her everything. then destroyed her before she even had time to live. Few steps away lies Betty Page, the legendary pin-up queen whose image became iconic across generations. Nearby stands Dean Martin, one of the coolest entertainers who ever lived, remembered forever through music, television, and charm. And everywhere you look, there's another story, another dream, another life swallowed by fame. Walking through this cemetery doesn't feel like visiting graves. It feels like wandering through the emotional wreckage of old Hollywood itself. A place where glamour and tragedy became inseparable. But standing in front of Marilyn Monroe's crypt, one question becomes impossible to ignore. Why do people still care so deeply? Why do strangers cry here? Why do they leave letters? Why do they whisper goodbye to someone they never knew? Maybe because Marilyn Monroe represents something larger than celebrity. She represents the human cost of being desired by the world, the exhaustion of becoming an image instead of a person, the pain of constantly performing happiness while privately falling apart. And maybe that's why her grave feels different from every other celebrity grave in Hollywood. People don't just mourn Marilyn Monroe, they mourn innocence. They mourn loneliness. They mourn the parts of themselves they hide behind smiles. Every day. Because beneath the glamour, Marilyn Monroe was painfully relatable. A human being desperate to feel loved for who she truly was. Perhaps the saddest part of Marilyn Monroe's story is that she spent her entire life searching for peace. And even after death, the world still struggles to let her rest. Her grave became an attraction, a tourist destination, a photo opportunity, a symbol. And now, even vandalism becomes part of her mythology. Maybe immortality isn't a gift after all. Maybe it's a prison built from memory. Because Marilyn Monroe achieved what millions dream about, she became unforgettable. But somewhere beneath the lipstick marks, camera flashes, flowers, tourists, and endless fascination, lies a woman who once sat alone wondering if anybody truly saw her at all. And perhaps, that's why her story still hurts people today. Not because she was perfect, but because she was human. Today, the vandalism has been cleaned away. The marble shines once again. Visitors continue arriving every day. And Marilyn Monroe remains exactly what she has always been, unforgettable. But maybe the real tragedy isn't how she died. Maybe it's the fact that the world still cannot stop consuming her. Still searching for pieces of itself inside her sadness. Still standing beside her grave hoping to feel closer to something they lost long ago. And somewhere inside this quiet cemetery hidden in Los Angeles, surrounded by old Hollywood legends, faded dreams, and eternal memories, rests a woman who spent her entire life trying to be loved beyond her beauty. A woman who gave the world a smile, while quietly carrying more pain than most people ever knew. And perhaps that's why people still leave flowers, still leave lipstick kisses, still whisper goodbye. Because deep down, they're not just mourning Marilyn Monroe. They're mourning every lonely person who ever felt unseen while the world kept staring at them. If this story touched you, share it with someone who may need to hear it. And if you or someone you love is struggling with depression or emotional pain, please remember this: asking for help is not weakness. And no matter how lonely life may feel, you are never truly alone. Leave a comment and tell us what Marilyn Monroe means to you, and which moment from her life or films you'll never forget. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful untold stories.